Good evening, and welcome to Skep Talk, the monthly speaker series hosted by the Bay Area Skeptics. Before tonight's presentation, a few words about Bay Area Skeptics. As North America's oldest skeptical organization, we are dedicated to promoting critical thinking, logic, and rational thought. In the 1970s and 80s, scientists such as Carl Sagan and magicians such as James Randi established the scientific skepticism movement out of concern about the popular fondness for pseudoscience and the lack of public science literacy. Scientific skepticism embraces evidence-based civil discourse on health, education, consumer protection, and especially the investigation of extraordinary claims. Using the scientific method, we hope to promote skeptical inquiry to reduce irrational thinking in society. This talk is supported by Bay Area Skeptics members such as you. Please visit us at baskeptics.org or join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Meetup. Consider supporting us through convenient monthly donations via Patreon. Patrons receive premiums such as discounts and free t-shirts for our annual Skeptical Conference. But more importantly, members help us make the world just a little more reasonable and rational. And now, tonight's speaker.
Good evening. I'm Eugenie Scott, president of Bay Area Skeptics. Now, some of you may have attended Skeptical last July, and if you did, you watched the panel Prebunking Fake News in an Election Year. You will remember tonight's speaker talking about his team's work on the last few United States elections, as well as elections around the world. He spoke of how foreign actors, especially China and Russia, for years have made concerted efforts to undermine both our elections and our democracy. Unfortunately, the Skeptical panel had to be taped in advance due to the schedule of one of the panelists, so no one was able to ask or answer questions at the time. I resolved then to bring our guest tonight back to talk about the 2024 election, especially since I can only imagine what his schedule has been like up until a very short time ago, and we are very grateful for him spending time with us tonight. I suspect he continues to be busy even after the election. Dr. Darren Linville is a professor in the communications department at Clemson University and co-director of the Media Forensics Hub. He has extensively researched the strategy and tactics of how foreign influence operations, especially Chinese and Russian, use social media. He's also helped develop the online game The Troll Quiz, wherein users attempt to distinguish between actual messages sent by either trolls or legitimate communicators. It's really fun. You should try it out. He has partnered with organizations including CNN, NBC, NPR, ProPublica, and the BBC to uncover foreign operations targeting domestic and foreign elections. Beyond his academic work, Darren has written for outlets including The Washington Post, Rolling Stone, Foreign Affairs, and Lawfare. Recently, researchers in the disinformation field from Clemson, Stanford, and the University of Washington have come under scrutiny by political actors who accuse them of conspiring with government agencies to, in their view, censor core political speech by private citizens. He has had the privilege of having his email subpoenaed and has testified before staff of Ohio Congressman Jim Jordan's House Judiciary Committee's Committee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government. And he and the Media Forensics Hub have been FOIA'd by independent, as they call themselves, researchers, which is an onerous, time-consuming, and research-detracting burden. But here at Bay Area Skeptics, Darren, there's no retribution. Welcome to Bay Area Skeptics.
Thanks for having me, Eugene. This is wonderful to be here tonight.
Well, I hope we have fun. I'm looking forward to interesting information. I hope not entirely frustrating and depressing. I mean, you're really a cheerful guy, but you know, my talks, they're always depressing to people. I do have a question for you, though, before you start, because it's something I'm curious about, and I don't know that this is something that you're planning to talk about in your lecture tonight. But, you know, last spring, the Supreme Court ruled in that Murphy versus Missouri that the case had to do with supposedly politically motivated efforts to disrupt cooperation among researchers like you, the government, and platforms, media. And the good news in the Murthy decision was that the Supreme Court decided that for the government agencies to provide information, much of which comes from the researchers, of course, but some from themselves, providing information to platforms about disinformation is not inherently coercive and could continue. I remember when you were talking to us last summer at Skeptical, you mentioned that, and I think the other panelists concurred, that the media platforms had pretty much just given up any kind of surveillance for the bad guys, any sort of efforts to get rid of disinformation and more bad stuff. Did the Murthy decision make any difference on that, or is it too early to tell? Or what do you what do you think about that?
I think it's too early to tell. Now, totally given up is strong language. There is still some things that the platforms do. Meta pulled back quite a bit, but they're still fairly involved in making sure that especially foreign actors aren't trying to engage in election disinformation. But even X still has a lot of automated systems that bots, which does cut down on some of the sort of thing that I'm talking about tonight, especially from China. China uses a lot of automated systems to attack the platform. Now, killing those sorts of things, at the end of the day, it doesn't make a big difference because they'll just make more. But they do have systems in place. Nothing like what they had before, but they are there. But to answer your core question, I think it is still a little early to tell. And given the results of the election, I think any progress that's been made in the last year is probably going to be backtracked on pretty quickly. Federal partners that I've worked with in the past several years have all been very touchy about anything related to working with the platforms, and I think that'll be multiplied by 10 now.
I did see an article that reported on the FBI coming back to inform the platforms when they have discovered when foreign actors are trying to present bad stuff. But again, it's nascent and it's just starting out. So, yeah. All right, well, you and I can have a chance to talk after your presentation, and there'll be questions from the audience also, I'm sure. So why don't you go ahead and tell us what you want to tell us? I'll look forward to seeing you at the end. Bye-bye.
Fantastic. So this evening, I want to walk through a brief history. If any of you were with us last July, you've had that before, so I'm going to touch on that very briefly. But what I really want to focus on is two lanes of where we're seeing disinformation go now. One of those being real world examples of AI used for social media disinformation, and the other being Russia's use of the influencer economy to fuel disinformation. So when you think of disinformation, in all probability, many of you probably think about trolls, specifically Russian trolls. This is a post from late 2016, almost 2017, from a Russian troll account run by the Internet Research Agency out of St. Petersburg called Jenna Abrams. Jenna was a really prolific troll that they ran, had tens of thousands of followers. She was active across platforms, not just on Twitter, but also on Instagram. And she had her own blog. Her blog is what she's linking to here. And she had a real impact on social media discourse, especially within the sort of right-leaning circles communities that she communicated with. Russian trolls obviously engaged on both ends of the spectrum back then. And in very specific communities on both the left and the right. Jenna, like a lot of trolls, and what you probably think of when you think of Russian trolls was biting, sarcastic, and very negative and extreme in all her views. This is an example from accounts that we identified and attributed to the Russian Internet Research Agency in 2020, active just in the run-up to the election before we worked with Twitter to get these accounts suspended. And again, just looking at these faces and the account descriptions, you can see that they engaged across the political spectrum. There were right-leaning accounts, Black Americans engaging in the Black Lives Matter movement conversations. There were LGBTQ Americans and even Latina American there, although she called herself Latino in Nevada, not Latina in Nevada. A sure sign that maybe there was something off with that account. But again, this is the sort of thing that historically we've thought of when we think of Russian trolls. But that is very much not what disinformation is today, or at least not coming out of Russia. Are there trolls much like this sort of artisanally handcrafted troll that's run by a real human being? Yes, there are still a lot of those, especially in countries that are trolling their own people. In fact, we just worked a couple of months ago to identify, map out, and suspend a network of almost 100 troll accounts run by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps that were targeting conversations in the UK. So yes, those are still active, but that's not what Russia is doing. A lot of, and this is sort of what that style of troll really worked to do. This is a network map that was created by a colleague of mine named Kate Starboard at the University of Washington. What this map shows, some of you may have seen this map before. It's a map of conversations around Black Lives Matter back in 2016. She collected millions of posts about Black Lives Matter at that time and put them in this network map. Every blue dot is a different account. How close the blue dots are to one another indicates how often those accounts communicated with one another, reposted each other's content, followed each other, that sort of thing. And so she collected this huge volume of data and wanted to know, oh, I wonder if there's any Russian accounts in this data. This was just after the Twitter released the names of various accounts that they attributed to the Russian Internet Research Agency. And so she went to look at her data to see if the Russians were taking part in conversations around Black Lives Matter. And sure enough, that's the orange in this image. They were engaged in both sides of the conversation, and you can see them almost pulling that conversation farther apart. That's fundamentally why the Internet Research Agency worked within different communities. It was to pull those communities and genuine American conversations farther apart from one another, making it more difficult for us to have real conversations with other real Americans, and ultimately more difficult to govern our country. And I think the depth and breadth of the impact that they may have had, I can't tell you that, but I can definitely show you in the world today the impact they wanted to have. It's very much alive. So, like I said, those Russian trolls, they're no longer there. Some of their impact may still be present. But when a lot of people think about disinformation today, they may also think about AI and the effects of artificial intelligence. I can tell you that in the most recent election, I don't think it had a big impact. Certainly not the impact that people might have feared. We didn't see deep fake videos of politicians doing, engaging in things that never occurred. And honestly, I wasn't afraid of that yet. AI isn't there yet. What AI can do, and what we have seen it do in a number of different ways, is it's used by bad actors in a lot of the same ways that my students use AI. And that's just to put out more content faster and cheaper than they would have otherwise. You can just, instead of one troll account, now you can run 50 with the same effort using AI. And all of these profile images that you see on the screen right now are profile images we took from a collection of about 800 troll accounts we identified on Twitter in the weeks before the election that were being run entirely using artificial intelligence. This was a set of accounts that we worked with journalists at NBC to report on, and they were shut down about 3 weeks before Election Day. This is what they looked like individually. You can see that a lot of these accounts were handcrafted. So while they were run using AI, they did take a human's hand at some point. So one reason I point this out is just to say that, these 800 accounts running on AI were not running out of some, one person's basement. This was a professional operation. They took a lot of handcrafting in their, the way that they were put together. You just looking at these 4 accounts here, the profile images match the banner images. Often the names connect to the visuals that you see. So there was both design and technical expertise going into this operation. It was a professional operation. In this case, though, we don't think these accounts were being run by a foreign operation. Just looking at the issues and candidates they targeted, because it was very much a political operation, we think that it was most likely a domestic actor. Some PAC or other politically motivated actor ran these accounts and targeted very specific politicians. They mostly targeted politicians on the left, including Harris Walsh, obviously. You can see the kind of content that they were posting. It might be a little small for you to see, but mostly what these accounts were doing, they weren't spreading disinformation. They weren't spreading lies. They were spreading just propaganda. They were changing perceptions about the number of people that felt a particular thing. And I think that can be important. Just that any marketing expert would tell you that the bandwagon persuasion is a very real thing. So when we wrote a brief white paper on these accounts, we called it digital yard signs, because that's essentially what these accounts were. They weren't spreading lies. They were just spreading perception about how your neighbors might think about candidates, and how many of your neighbors might think that thing about candidates. They targeted Harris Walsh. They targeted political senatorial campaigns, especially Tammy Baldwin. Campaigns that were marginal, especially it could go one way or the other. Tammy Baldwin was one of those cases. They heavily targeted her campaign, but they didn't just target candidates on the left. They also targeted a number of candidates on the right in primaries, and a couple of very specific issues, which is why we think this was most likely a domestic actor. We couldn't find any connection between the various candidates that they were targeting, the various issues that they were targeting, that any state actor would have been, really focused on. And the fact that we think this was a domestic actor actually scares me more than the idea that this was some foreign actor trying to manipulate conversations on social media here in the United States. Because if this becomes a thing that's picked up, as just another tactic that you can engage in, that's concerning to me. We have seen AI being used a lot by accounts that are have some kind of financial motivation. So, for instance, selling cryptocurrency, for instance, or even T-shirts. But this was the first time that we saw what we felt confidently was, a domestic political operative running a very large bot campaign. How effective it is, that's another conversation that we can have. But I can say that to an extent, it doesn't have to be that effective to be worth it, because not a lot of effort goes into this sort of thing. And when done at scale, I really do think it can be effective. What these accounts were doing, none of them had very many followers, certainly not real followers, but they were just engaging in the replies of other larger accounts. And that's one thing that bad actors can do, and certainly it's done in the marketing world as well. If you want an account to be seen, a brand new account was just created yesterday. It has no followers, nobody has a reason to engage with it, but you might engage with it in the replies of another account. This is a tactic that's done on many different platforms, obviously not just X. We know that these accounts were being run by AI, not only because of a number of various little clues in how they were operating, but the big clue was the AI actually told you periodically that it was AI. If you get enough, we had, we put together more than 650 of these accounts all together, downloaded all of their content. That gives you, I think at the end of the day, we had something like 200,000 posts to look at. The AI in 200,000 posts is gonna make a few mistakes. And they told us, in those mistakes, those prompt leaks that some of you may know something about, it told us a lot about how they were scripted. And they even told us what, large language model they were being run on. This particular campaign was being run on Dolphin, which is a specific large language model made by its creator to avoid some of the ethical pitfalls that the more mainstream large language models that you may be familiar with follow. So a number of different things concerning about this campaign. But at the end of the day, like I said, I'm not sure how much that sort of campaign had an impact on conversations. I do know that the Russians have had an impact on the conversations, an impact that I have found very concerning. And the way they've had that impact is by engaging with the influencer economy. We've been tracking a particular campaign that the Russians have engaged in since about this time last year called Storm 1516. Now, Storm 1516 was named that by the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center. My lab first identified Storm 1516 back in December of last year. We made it public. We made the mistake of not actually naming it, though. And Microsoft subsequently named it, and so they get the credit. So we're all calling it Storm 1516 now, even though that sounds like a Jack Ryan novel. In any case, Storm 1516 is a narrative laundering campaign. And what narrative laundering is a very old process going back to the days of the Soviet KGB of placing a false story, layering that false story into conversation in such a way that it distances that story from its actual source and integrating it into general conversation. Storm 1516 has been very successful at this throughout most of 2023 and early 2024, targeting conversations about Ukraine. They have done it in a number of different ways, laundering the narratives. They're quite famous for, you may have read about their use of fake news pages. So they'll create a news page, something like DC Weekly or the Miami Chronicle, and then use that news page, pay an influencer, use one of their own in-house influence accounts to post about that story. And because it has this legitimate sounding news page associated with it, it gets picked up and people talk about it and they cite that news page. They've also used foreign news pages, especially in West Africa and the Arab world, to do much the same thing. But here we see examples of one of their more successful stories from November of last year that they laundered. A story about Zelensky purchasing 2 yachts worth a total of $75 million. They laundered that story through a website they created called DC Weekly. They placed that story in a couple of West African news pages. And then they used their own influencers, people like Tara Reid. Tara Reid is famous for being a staffer, a Biden staffer from the 90s that accused him of sexual assault. But since then, she's actually moved to Moscow. She works for RT, and she is part of the Storm 1516 distribution network, or certainly was at this point. And so they used influencers like her and a number of others that I could name to post this story. And then it gets picked up by other influencers, people like Kim.com, who probably has no direct connection to the Russian influence apparatus, but certainly, is the sort of individual whose community would repeat these stories and who might have a sort of pro-Russian bent to a lot of his posting. So he picks it up out of the sort of digital ecosystem after paid Russian influencers put it there. And it gets picked up and it becomes just part of the common conversation. So it's placed in this sort of false context, layered by influencers that the Russians paid, and then integrated by influencers that are more genuine in their desire to spread that message. Kim.com, his post about the yacht was viewed by millions of people. This yacht narrative was even picked up and repeated by decision makers here in the United States. It was repeated by J.D. Vance. It was repeated by a couple of folks in Congress just days before they were due to vote on support for Ukraine. So clearly a very successful narrative. You can see, one nice thing about this narrative from a researcher's perspective is it has this very unique word in it, yacht. Before November, nobody's talking about Zelensky and yacht in the same sentence. After November, tens of thousands of people on social media are putting those two words in the same sentence. So you can really see the effect of it. So in the week following this narrative's introduction, if you take all the posts that included Zelensky in the week following the introduction of this narrative, 10% of them included the word yacht somewhere in that post. And if you think about it, that's just a staggering percentage if you think about all of the different conversations that happen about Zelensky and how most of those are actually driven by mainstream media. 10% of a conversation is just a really big chunk to come from a completely made up Russian story. So that's what Storm 1516 does. That's what they've done very well. We've tracked more than 60 narratives now that they have laundered in ways similar to this. And they were obviously very, very active during the election. Here are two examples of posts that they were responsible for creating the original video for during the election. A couple of these you may have even heard of. The one on the left is an individual ripping up ballots in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. It's not a video of an individual in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. This was probably made in St. Petersburg and laundered into the digital ecosystem by influencers that were paid to do so by the Russians. And the same with the video on the right. That was a video of supposed Haitian immigrants who in the video say that they were flown to the United States, given false papers, and they were going around Forsyth and Fulton County, Georgia, and voting in the election. Again, it was a post that was created in St. Petersburg. With that particular post, we had a little bit of good luck again as researchers, and we were able to identify the actual human behind the account that first posted it. It was an individual in Massachusetts. I could tell you a lot about him, but I won't. But because we were able to work with CNN to actually speak to that individual, CNN was able to convince that person to tell the whole story, how he was contacted by an influencer, how he was paid $100 a post to post content by that influencer. It was a pro-Russian influencer. We even know the name of that influencer. It was an Australian citizen who lives very long story. I won't tell the whole thing, but it's an Australian citizen who lives in the Russian embassy in Sydney because he's wanted by the Australian authorities on various charges. but since he lives in the embassy in Sydney, in the Russian embassy in Sydney, he's a registered Russian agent, works for RT, has deep connections to the network that we've been following for a year and a half now, and I'm hopeful we'll receive an indictment over his involvement in spreading this video. All right, so I want to ask Steve to, in just a second, to play a video, because what I want to do now is walk through in detail the narrative laundering process. I'm going to do that with the most recent narrative that we've seen, and that is this video that came out the day after the election, because I think this video communicates a lot about what we can expect from Russian disinformation in the coming months in terms of it being basically a lobbying effort. But I wanted to stop and warn you real quick that this video contains gunfire. It's a little bit loud, especially at the beginning, and scenes of violence. So I apologize. It is a mannequin that's being shot, not obviously a real person. So Steve, if you would please play the video. So when I first saw that video, day after the election, I knew immediately that it was Russian disinformation, not just because of who was sharing it, but because of what I saw in the video itself. Now, this video looks sophomoric. It looks like something, some bored middle school boys would make in their backyard with, too much time on their hands. But it's actually very thoughtfully done because of first of all, its simplicity. It tells a very clear story. It's speaking to a very specific audience. It's saying to, in particular, right-leaning MAGA Americans, Ukrainians hate you. It has one message, and it's a simple one. There is no ambiguity to this video, and that is important in reaching the audience that they're trying to reach, which is a very specific audience. It's also very clean in what it doesn't show. What it does show. It shows a Ukrainian soldier and a MAGA t-shirt on a mannequin with a red hat. Very simple storytelling. But it's also very clean in what it doesn't show. And I think that's more important than what it does show from my perspective. It shows a man in Ukrainian uniform, but that's all that uniform tells you, is that it's Ukrainian. It doesn't give you any, unit designation. It doesn't give you any information that might help me understand who that person is, other than that he's a Ukrainian soldier, supposedly. And the same is true with the location. The video is taken into a hillside. The camera doesn't pan to anything that might help an open source investigator identify where this video is taken or who these individuals are. There's nothing to track on this video. There's nothing that will help me understand, who these people actually are or where they actually are. And that is very, very purposefully done. So the first thing we had to do was figure out where this video was actually came from. And we were able to track its first appearance to Discord, the communication platform, to a Ukrainian language account called Ukraine is Life that was posting on, that had just been created just, a week and a half before the election. And it posted in its very first post in Ukrainian on welcome on the Squad Ukraine channel. So this is a pro-Ukrainian Discord channel. And that's its post there on the right. I have a translation here. Its very first post of this Discord account was, hello, how do I send a video? I have a good one. Not suspicious at all. And a day later, it posts this video with the video we just watched for the first time with this message. The fate of Ukraine cannot be decided without Ukraine. He will answer for his plans for peace, which is essentially a defeat. So it has this obviously very angry pro-Ukrainian message attached to the video. Appears on Ukraine or appears on Discord out of nowhere. It goes from there to Telegram, where unfortunately a lot of disinformation spreads on the official channel of the Ukrainian 79th Airborne Assault Brigade. If you don't follow Russian language social media like I do, and I don't recommend it, you might not be aware that in both Ukraine and Russia, units involved in the combat, a lot of them tend to have their own Telegram channels. This purports to be one of those. So it even tells the reader, hey, I got this off of Discord. And it posts the video there on Telegram. Turns out, though, that there are two Telegram channels that purport to belong to the Ukrainian 79th Air Assault Brigade. And the one posting this video is not the one that is linked to from the Ukrainian government website. The one posting the video also spends a lot of time defending itself as the real one, and a lot of time critical of the Ukrainian government, strangely, attacking Ukrainian corruption. Weird, I know. From that Telegram channel, it went to another Telegram channel, the Telegram channel of Oleg Syarov. He's a Ukrainian separatist politician who is obviously pro-Russian. He's a puppet politician of the Russian state, but probably not a frequent reader of the 79th Air Assault Telegram channel. But his post immediately gives this video credibility. He's a politician, a real person. We can identify him. And so from there, it's picked up by Russian state media, by Pravda, in a very simple post. It doesn't even have an article associated with it. Pravda just posted this. Again, this is the layering process. Each of these steps in the layering process takes that video farther and farther away from its original appearance and farther away from being illegitimate. And each of these steps is designed to give the video more and more legitimacy till it appears on state media, and then to the Storm 1516 network that we've been tracking. The X account there on the left, Lord Bibo, is a pro-Russian account. We believe him to be a real British person, but he has become very successful and has a successful account posting pro-Russian content. The Telegram channel there on the left, The Islander, is an account that is at least in part run by Che Bose. He's an Irish journalist who works for RT and is also very tightly connected to the Storm 1516 network. And both of these posts were very successful, especially the Lord Bibo post. It was reposted 800 times. And so from there, it really went viral. The next day, it exploded across X. If you are a right-leaning English speaker on X, you saw this video. An early morning post had 12.5 million views of this video. And again, it was a video that was very purposefully spread. This is Russia's first message the day after the election, and that is stop funding Ukraine. Russian disinformation has always been about Ukraine. The Russian Internet Research Agency originally was founded to talk about Ukraine. It was founded in 2014. That was when the war first started in eastern Ukraine. And the first messages coming out of the IRA were in Russian, targeting the population of Ukraine. It was only later that the IRA became something that targeted the West. And so in targeting Ukraine in such a focused manner as Russia is doing now, they're really just returning to what they did before. And in this shift that we see right after the election, talking about Ukraine again, very, very expected. I am sure that there were a number of videos that were queued up should Harris have won, that were prepared to undermine the election, but she didn't. And so instead, this is what we have. We have what is going to be an ongoing lobbying effort trying to make Trump supporters angry and the message to Trump himself clear: stop supporting Ukraine. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over for a few minutes of questions.
All right, thank you. Yeah, kind of depressing.
I'm not the guy you come to for hope.
Oh, I actually saw you quoted in a newspaper article that you were, what was it exactly? I think you said hope is a trap. You said, which does sound a little bit pessimistic. But.
I know the article you're talking about, yeah. And in fact, that was an article about investigations by the House Judiciary, and I said, I think things might get better, but hope is a trap. And literally the next day, the House Judiciary's Twitter account pulled that quote out and attacked me.
Well, look, I don't
right.
think I recently had the privilege of making the acquaintance of Renee DiResta, who, like Kate Starbird and you, have been kicked around a fair amount by Mr. Jordan and his friends.
Oh, both of them have gotten it far worse than we have.
I'm happy to hear that. I don't think anybody should, I'm sure this is not a contest that you want to win by any stretch of the imagination.
Living in
if they leave you alone, that's just great. But
I am not the target that Stanford is.
This is very.
Or Washington.
I don't know what Clemson must have done something right. That's the only thing I can think of or whatever. But not that the Stanford Internet Stanford Internet Observatory did anything wrong that I can tell. I mean,
having a winning football team makes up for a lot of sins. Got
a point for many people in this country. Steve is waiting to try to find some questions. Aha! We do have a question from. I'm sorry. My apologies for those of you watching. I'm having problems with my vision tonight, so I'm going to get quite close to the screen in order to read it. Here we go. From Josh Nankville, how could these schemes be detected automatically when they're getting started and stopped?
It's very difficult, Josh, to especially the sort of thing that the Russians are doing now using the influencer economy. It takes research, for me to verify that video that I just showed you was Russian. I don't know of a way that one could do that automatically. It takes a human analyst to go in and do that digging. I will say that I felt that, especially when it came to narratives around election integrity, we did a great job. By we, I mean the system, especially the intelligence apparatus, the ODNI, the FBI, and CISA together made a number of public statements, and various investigators online did a great job of quickly responding to some of these narratives. It didn't stop them, it especially didn't stop them in the communities that initially spread them and frankly perhaps wanted to believe them because they were primed to believe them. Mm-hmm. But it did stop those narratives from spreading into mainstream media or broader, more moderate networks or other platforms. And so I was very proud of the response and the work that was done to mitigate the spread of these narratives. It took a lot of work. We worked for a year to understand the network, to be ready for it, and to make sure that these narratives wouldn't have a bigger impact than there was sort of a minimal impact that they were going to have, and we wanted to make sure that they didn't go past that minimal impact. But I think at the end of the day, it was kept to that minimal impact, and or at least this particular branch of Russian disinformation, the Storm 1516 branch.
So when you, for example, when you detected this fake video that you were able, with a lot of shoe leather, to trace back actually to a Russian source, what did you do when you had that information? How did you disseminate the information that this was not a legitimate Ukrainian unit?
With this video, all I did was make a post. The same was true with the Bucks County video, the Haitian immigrant video in Fulton County. There was another video on election night that was supposedly an individual being attacked for wearing a MAGA hat in Wisconsin. In each of those cases, I made a post.
You made a post where?
On X, the platform that was spreading these messages.
The platform where it had occurred.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I had a number of journalists and fact checkers that I would immediately, send messages to on Signal. And federal partners.
And then they would disseminate the information. Yeah. Well, it would be, I don't know how, but then I'm not a researcher in this area, so I don't have to be. But it would be wonderful to try to make an estimate of how many people received those. I hate to call it a debunking, but in a sense it is a debunking, but those communications from the people that you reached with this correct information, and spread them further.
That's the difficult thing. I would point out that sometimes that there are cases where the Russians want to be identified. How to talk about disinformation is a difficult thing to wrap your head about it and understand what is the right response. Now, I think when it comes to these election integrity videos, the response was clear. A robust, loud, and fast, no, that is not true. That is not accurate. Here are the ways we know that to be the case. But just in the week prior to the election, there was a narrative going around, and maybe it was 2 weeks prior, a narrative that was being spread by the Russians that Waltz engaged in sexual activity with a student while he was a high school coach in the 90s. It spread widely. Tens of thousands of people reposted this narrative. We knew it to be a Russian-created narrative. Well, actually, there were a few versions of it. 2 of the 3 versions of the narrative were made by the Russians. But the way they disseminated it, I won't go into all the details here. They made it obvious in a really unsubtle way. And I'm confident that was on purpose. Like it was so obvious as to be insulting. And I think that was on purpose, because every journalist I spoke to on that story said the Harris campaign didn't want the story done. Because anybody in marketing
the Harris campaign didn't want what?
Didn't want the debunk done. They didn't want the story done.
I mean, they wanted
anyone in marketing. Anyone in marketing will tell you there are certain stories you don't engage with, no matter how bad they are.
Oh.
You don't want your candidate's name in the same sentence as.
Got it.
Full stop.
Got it. So they were just hoping, the Wallace campaign was hoping that this obviously falls. I mean, to them.
It had died out. The story had died out because.
But it would not have died out if there had been a big bunch of publicity about, this is, more.
But there was a second.
Fake.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pinning it on the Russians gave it a second life. And almost as many people talked about it the second time around as talked about it the first time around.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
That's great. All right. There's another question. Excuse me, I'll have to get close. Do you believe that the U.S. intelligence agencies or other U.S. official agencies do much the same with mis and disinformation, either directly or via individuals, to the Russian and Chinese public?
We know that they have. There was at least one State Department campaign that we know of and that became public that targeted Iranian dissidents. And there was at least one DoD campaign that has become public. I think it was run by the Air Force, if I recall correctly. I'd have to go back and check, but it has been done. The French very famously and publicly acknowledged that they engaged in the same kind of activity in Mali in order to try to counter Russian disinformation in Mali. I mean, disinformation is worse anywhere in the world that doesn't speak English than it is in the West, especially by countries that target their own people. So it is done. I don't think it is something that is done at scale, because we have Hollywood, we have Voice of America, and I am confident it's not done in China because it would just, I mean, they have such tight control over their social media and media because they just, you
So
couldn't.
it wouldn't be worth your while.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And I've never seen it done well by an American.
Oops. Oh, well. Question from David Wheelock. I would like to see a dashboard with, quote, today's inflammatory memes, showing source of origin, revealing where they are from a foreign origin, domestic, troll, or real person. Is that possible? That sounds like
you could do it, but it would just show you a list of real of genuine influencers, real.
The vast majority of them.
It would just be one after another a domestic influencer. Most content we see on social media is created by real people, put out by real people. So I should put a lot of caveats on that. Depends on where you are in the world. It depends on the subject that you're talking about. If you're talking about cryptocurrency, most of the content's garbage and fake. Or there are a number of topics where everybody's fake. Pornography is another obvious one where everybody's fake on social media. But when you're talking about memes, most memes are created by real people.
Good to know.
You can go. The German Marshall Fund runs a platform called Hamilton 68 that tries to track Russian talking points of the day. That's the closest thing I know of to what you're talking about there. We are working towards that to something similar at Clemson, where we want to track conversations around elections, specifically in the global South, where disinformation is a much bigger problem than it is here in the States.
We have a question from WatchC. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your handle there. Can you share a resource with us that we can use to provide questions to our friends so as to increase their level of skepticalness or critical thinking with regards to not believing such fake news?
I wish I could share some amazing resources with you, but there's been so little funding in this space in the past 4 years that it's hard. So we made the Spot the Troll quiz 4 years ago, and it's completely outdated now. I mean, it's still fun to go take, but we've been looking for money to rebuild it because that sort of thing is not cheap. Just building a website costs $50,000. and maintaining it for, a lot. A lot of people are going to use the website. That takes money too. And we can't get them. I mean, we're going to build it. I'm going to be working on that in the coming months. We're going to be using some of our own in-house money to fund it. I've been part of another National Science Foundation project where we were building tools for older adults. This was a multi-million-dollar project, building modules and a gamified system to teach older adults. The original plan for this project was for it to have a disinformation component. But I actually, when they put me on the team, advocated to not talk about mis and disinformation because I was afraid of the funding implications. And the project became about fraud. Its focus is fraud, which I think is extremely important. And
for elderly people especially.
If not, at the end of the day, I think actually fraud is more important in many respects than mis and disinformation. It's a multi-billion-dollar problem. And especially for older adults, it's a huge problem that we're simply not doing enough about. And so we turned that project to focus specifically on fraud. There are a couple of games that you can look up. I'm just blanking on the names of them because it's late here on the East Coast.
Thank you.
But we really don't have the tools that we need to have. There are countries that are doing it better than us, especially Scandinavian countries and Baltic countries, countries that are right on the doorstep of Russia. But the response, it's not going to be solved by some fun tools online. It's going to be solved by a whole of society response to some of these problems.
I believe the Finns have done particularly well
Yes.
in that in terms of their education system.
And they have every reason to.
Yeah. Speaking of countries on the border of Russia. All right, we have a question from Annika QED. What about the story being spread by one of Trump's people that the U.S. is sponsoring biolabs in Ukraine? That's an oldie but goodie.
That is the oldest of Russian propaganda stories. I've seen versions of this more times than I can count. They especially, not just from the Russians, from the Chinese as well. They love to blame Fort Detrick. Fort Detrick, the most famous narrative laundering campaign for nerds like myself is the Russian narrative laundering campaign, where they planted the story that the CIA created the AIDS virus.
Oh yeah.
And disseminated that story. Originally they posted it in a newspaper in India that they actually ran. The KGB ran this newspaper in India. It's a propaganda paper. And then they disseminated it around the globe. To this day, a lot of people around the globe think that the CIA created the AIDS virus. But that original story talked about Fort Detrick, Maryland. And I lost track of the number of Chinese trolls I've seen talking about Fort Detrick, especially it came back up when, during COVID. COVID was made at Fort Detrick, Maryland. And Fort Detrick runs the biolabs in Ukraine. The Storm 1516 campaign that I've been talking about had at least one narrative about biolabs and a couple actually related to it. There was another one about pharmaceutical companies running tests on new COVID drugs on Ukrainian children, and they were dying as a result of it. Pharmaceuticals in general, and biologic, these are things that unique thing that captures the minds of a conspiracy theorist might be an issue that a disinformation campaign is going to use as a wedge to try to help spread, that they'll piggyback on those conspiracy theories to spread other ideas.
I know that for people who are interested in climate change, there's a very good site that provides accurate information on a lot of stories that spread around the anti-climate change sphere, as it were, and that's skepticalscience.org. So for listeners, reader, viewers, if you are looking for good, solid information on what scientists really say about climate change, as opposed to the sun's getting hotter and some of these other narratives that are being spread about and probably will continue, skepticalscience.org. But there isn't a sort of a general clearinghouse for political things at all that I know of, which and for Darren would know. So alas.
I will say the Russians have never gotten on board with climate change.
No, I don't think that's their thing.
And the same with there was a lot of conversation about COVID disinformation being spread by foreign states too. They didn't really, I think, because most nation states saw it as just as much of a threat to themselves as to others. The only places we really saw disinformation being spread was some combativeness about what vaccine to take. So, like, Russia was spreading some disinformation about vaccines because they wanted people using their vaccine. But even that, I think, backfired to a degree.
John asks, how could these schemes be detected automatically? Wait a second.
I
think that's one we already, or a question very similar to that. I think we've already had it. Here we go. Please tell us how your research handles the language/translation issues. And could disseminating in Russian be an easy way to bypass word filters common in social media?
I barely speak English sometimes. The language is a problem. Mostly we use Google Translate at the end of the day, which is not perfect, but we deal with so many languages in our work that we do have some members of the team that do speak other languages, and that can be useful, but it's also it's a matter of scale. We have used AI models to do some translation. We're starting to do that more and more, using AI models to do the translation for us.
Right.
But the good news is we live in a time where these language differences don't matter as much as they did before. Mm-hmm. Obviously, it's a problem. I'm not saying it's not.
It would be lovely if you had a whole bunch of students who are
you don't get the nuance, you don't get the metaphors. Yeah. But the other thing I would say is that a lot of the work we do is actually content agnostic. We're looking at markers that have nothing to do with what the accounts are saying, but with especially some of the technology we're developing for identifying coordination. It has nothing to do with the words. It has to do with other factors, elements of the accounts themselves.
I heard or read a story recently. I forget exactly where it was, talking about the identification of a Chinese story that was spreading about, and the way that one of the ways they detected it was, again, language independent. They noticed that the vast majority of the posts occurred during Chinese working hours, with time off for lunch and time off for dinner.
Yeah, timing is crucial. Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, these guys are phoning it in. They're not even trying to be stealthy. But anyway, listen, it is very late on the East Coast, as you gently pointed out, and we've kept you for a good long time, and appreciated very much all of your insights to this problem. I was looking at some of the comments over on YouTube, and there were people who, I wouldn't say that they joined you in your abandonment of hope, but there's a lot of concern about this issue, and it's very important that you and your colleagues are doing this kind of work, and many of us are very grateful to you for doing it. So thank you for your work, and thank you also sincerely for spending a night with us here at Bay Area Skeptics.
It was a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Now, the rest of you, next month on December 12th at 6:30, an hour earlier than our usual our usual Skep Talk, our speaker will be Dr. Massimo Pigliucci. evolutionary biologist and philosopher. Now, you've read Massimo's columns in the Skeptical Inquirer. You may have heard him speak at Skepticon or some other meetings. If you have ever heard him speak in person, you know that he's a really good speaker, and this will be well worth your time to join us. And as always, with Darren's talk or anybody else's talk on the Skep Talk program, if you can't join us on the second Thursday of the month, that same URL will be open for you to watch the programs at any time convenient for you. Massimo's title for next month's talk is The Problem with Scientism and the Nature of the Skeptic Community. So a serious topic having to do with us as skeptics and his suggestions for how we may think of some very important issues. So thank you very much for coming tonight, everyone, and see you next month. Good night.